They searched my shop for 15 minutes and still paid me to finish the hem that would sink their convoy. The lieutenant stood so close I could smell his shaving soap over the starch. His greatcoat lay across my table, epaulets off, lining open like a mouth that trusted me. I chalked a harmless line, slid 2 pins, and, while he watched the needle, fed a strip of paper into the hem between 2 rows of invisible stitches. The paper wasn't paper. It was a carbon-thin film, numbers written as sizes on a pattern, 38-42-41. Not a chest, but 3 trains and their timetable. Fast, he said in German, as if speed were a virtue. Straight, I answered in French, as if straight were safer than true. The sergeant by the door tapped his boot, bored. The lieutenant flirted with my tape measure, letting it coil around his wrist while I measured his sleeve. He bragged about a transfer to the coast, about crates that would move at night without needing lights. I nodded as if men told me their plans every day while I basted their cuffs. When they left, the bell on the door sounded like a pardon. I turned the coat over, pressed the hem flat, and watched the secret disappear into the neatness my mother taught me. Then I folded the greatcoat with respect for the soldier and a different respect for the sea that would be waiting. I carried the coat to the mirror and pinned it on him the way a mother pins a saint to a child, straight, secure, with a prayer kept behind the teeth. He preened. I smiled. In the mirror, I could see the doorway behind us, and, beyond it, the street where laundry lines wrote soft messages across the air. On my counter, a paper packet of needles waited for the woman who would ask for number 7 sharps and mean tonight. I set the hem, coaxed the fabric to forget my hands had been inside it, and nicked a single thread, my mark, for the courier who knew where to look. Your work, the lieutenant said, is impossible to detect. He meant to compliment his uniform. I let the words land where I needed them. That is the point, I said, snipping the thread with the little sound that ends one truth and begins another. He paid, overpaid, then folded a smile across my counter as if a smile could be a receipt for power. The bell rang once, twice. Boots on stone, then silence thick enough to stitch. I locked the door and turned the sign. In the back room, I unrolled the pattern paper for a dress that would never be cut. Along the edges, chalk marks looked like darts and actually mapped a siding 2 miles beyond the station, where you could make a train wait without anyone calling it sabotage. I tucked the pattern into a brown envelope with the size 42 on it. The woman who wore 42 weighed 90 pounds. Sizes were the only lies I told without regret. The courier came as a customer, the sort of woman shopkeepers pity and soldiers ignore. She asked for thread the color of smoke, and I gave her gray. She asked for number 7 sharps, and I put the envelope on the counter, the pattern folded inside like a quiet heart. We did not look at each other too long. Looking is a kind of confession. Before she left, I took her sleeve as if to hem it and pricked her once. Accident. Apology. Leaving a dot of blood on the cuff that would tell the man at the church steps she hadn't been followed. She flinched, then smiled the way tired people do when the world briefly remembers they are alive. After she was gone, I swept the floor for 15 minutes with the door unlocked and the bell unwatched. That is what innocence looks like from the street. On the table, the lieutenant's receipt lay under the pin cushion. I wrote on the back in pencil 3 numbers that meant nothing in German and everything in our arithmetic, 38-42-41. Then I fed the scrap into the mouth of the stove and watched the ash learn discretion. By dusk, my shop smelled of wool, soap, and plans. I wound the tape back into a coil that, to anyone else, measured sleeves. To us, each mark was a number, each number a train, each train a piece of a machine that could be unthreaded. I turned the sign to closed and waited for the night to let me pass. By day, I spoke the languages that keep a shop alive. It will sit better after the steam. This cloth behaves if you are patient. Stand straight, please. Pins between my lips, chalk in my fingers. I became what uniforms forget, a woman who sees, touches, measures. Measurement is permission. The tape slid under collars, across shoulders, around waist where holsters rested. I never needed to look down to know the model of a sidearm. Weight talks through cloth. Men talk too, when their throats are held up by collars that fit. The quartermaster complained that the new depot stamped its bolts wrong. He showed me a sample, proud of his misery. I noted the initials on the head of the bolt the way I noticed stain. Small, revealing, easily missed. A signalman griped about extra trains burning his sleep. I agreed that foremen were tyrants and kept his timetable in my chalk. 3 neat dashes on the edge of a pattern no one would buy. Ration books came through my till like obedient paper soldiers. I traded seam scraps for coupons, coupons for thread, thread for silence in the queue. Women told the truth while deciding between 2 buttons, the price of flour, the rumor about a convoy that would skip the main line to save time, the lieutenant who liked his cuffs narrow and his secrets narrower. I said humano, and of course, and pinned a hem exactly where a pocket stopped so I would remember where he kept his orders. At noon I took in mending for the barracks laundry, bad stitching in good cloth, the kind of laziness hierarchy always produces. Laundry tags wore numbers. Numbers wore routes if you knew who collected on Thursdays. I kept the tags long enough to lose one and redraw it with a second hand to see where it landed. It landed at the freight yard office. Useful. The ration office clerk brought me her cardigan with moth bites like constellations. I fixed the stars and paid her in butter paper and newsprint, the only currencies that leave no ledger. She, in turn, tutade about the special deliveries requisitioned without stamp, the ones that always arrive at night. Enough complaint makes a corridor you can walk down without being seen. In the evenings, I made house calls to officers' quarters with a basket of needles and respectable lies. A uniform left on a chair will tell you how far its owner walks. Mud is a language, too. Clay from the embankment carries yellow in its shame. Platform soot is fine and mean and lives in cuffs. Coastal sand hides and seems like a rumor. I brushed, sponged, pressed, cataloged. One night an officer's wife called me for an emergency. A rip along the lining where her husband had hidden a chocolate bar from her and it had betrayed him. In the tear I saw the corner of a carbon copy. Thin, gray, eager to be forgotten. I stitched without comment, then set the iron to steam over the pocket and watched the damp pull up the blind stamp. ABT. T. Transport. K. YD3. The yard 3 we needed. I smiled into the steam. Back in the shop, I translated the day into our grammar. Chalk marks on a sleeve head became train counts on the downline. Basting threads of 2 colors meant extra guards attached. A harmless tailor's tack at the shoulder. My reminder that the depot commander wears his keys on the right, not the left. Doors prefer the inattentive. I wrote none of it down where eyes could find it. The tape kept the numbers. My hands kept the rest. By closing, my counter held only needles and coins. My head held routes, times, weights. I drew a hem on a pattern nobody wanted and made it 2 millimeters deeper than fashion. Room for a secret to live where even pride wouldn't feel it. Buttons are vaults if you know the locksmith trade. I bored the shank channels wider with a hot needle, cooled the shell in a saucer, and slid a curl of microfilm inside. Carbon so thin it rode the breath. A dab of wax, a stitch through the eye to secure the button, and the secret hung there like any other piece of brass no one bothers to admire. Spall and lint tell stories too. I shook cuffs over clean paper and read the fallout. Coal soot, yard. Fine quartz, ballast. A ribbon of rust, break dust from a siding that likes to hold trains longer than is polite. I kept the paper until it could be mistaken for rubbish and then fed it to the stove after my memory had stitched it where it belonged. Epaulets are arrogant. They hide things badly. I unpicked one stitch at the shoulder strap, just enough to slide a needle through, and left a sliver of hair, dyed red, mine, caught in the seam. If a coat returned with that hair gone, I'd know someone else had been inside it. If it returned with the hair still there, the coat was only a coat and the man only a man. Linings are maps if you draw them with thread. I ran a row of understitching that looked like vanity work and wasn't. Long, short, short, long. Intervals that matched distances between sidings on the west spur. A tailor might admire the neatness. A railway man would feel a tug in his bones and not know why. Along the facing I hid 2 knots where a pocket mouth curves. Left knot meant diverted to yard 3. Right knot meant guards attached. The man who wore it would never feel the signal brushing his ribs. For orders copied on onion skin, I favored the collar stand. Stiff, obedient, ignored. A slit no longer than a thumbnail. A roll tucked flat as breath. And the secret sat under a man's chin while he barked at the world. If I needed to mark a document for my courier, I ran a single white basting thread through the collar's back seam. She would lift it with a pin and no-take this before laundry. If the thread was blue, she knew burn after reading. We used blue rarely. Fire is a loud editor. Now and then a tunic arrived with a button missing and urgency plastered on the face that brought it. I would replace it with one of mine, identical, weight and gloss. And inside it wrote a timetable thin as gilt. To test my work, I dropped the spare on the floorboards. The right button gives you a sound between coin and seed. Mine always did. Shoulder pads are smug little pillows. I emptied one and filled it with scents. A twist of tissue held a graphite rubbing I'd taken from an embossed stamp on an order, mirror letters that read correctly when pressed against glass. I stitched the pad back in loose, so a curious hand would feel cheap work and stop there, comforted by its own contempt. Belt loops got their turn too. I threaded a horsehair stiffener through one, our sign for bridge ahead, count spans before charges. To anyone else, it was over-engineering. To us, it was a route with teeth. For couriers who couldn't risk paper, I sewed signals into wear itself. A line of repair along the seat seam. 3 overhand stitches spaced like mileposts told her which siding. A decorative tack at the cuff suggested the hour. If a coat crossed too many rooms before reaching her, those stitches might be unpicked by a tidy sole. That was fine. Tidy soles return garments fast, and speed is a kind of mercy. Before closing, I did what I always do. I turned out my own pockets and found nothing I couldn't afford to lose. Then I stood at the mirror and practiced being nobody. The face that knows thread counts, but not timetables. When the bell rang at last, and the lieutenant's orderly returned for his master's coat, I handed him back a uniform that was lighter by one fear and heavier by one calamity to come. The mercery smelled of starch and resignation. Bolts of calico marched in tired ranks. Drawers of buttons clicked like old abacuses. I arrived at opening with an order that could pass inspection, thread, bias tape, hooks and eyes, and a bundle of pattern paper rolled around nothing. The shopkeeper's son swept sawdust in lazy figure eights. His broom told me more than his mouth ever would. At the counter, I laid down a dress pattern marked with darts that would flatter no one. The chalk notches looked like size adjustments. They were sidings. The broken line along the hem was not fashion but detour. A faint pricked will trace, made with my old tracing spoked, mapped the curve where yard 3 splits from the main. She peered over spectacles, tooted at my extravagance, and slid me a packet of number 7 sharps. The paper was too heavy for needles. Good. Heaviness convinces. We spoke in the language of seams while the real conversation happened under our hands. She wrapped my pattern in brown paper and tied it with string not once but twice. The second, not the kind a grandmother uses on a christening charm. 2 knots meant take the church route. 1 would have meant station stairs. I paid in coupons and coin, no names, no ledger, and left with a parcel that admitted to being a harmless lie. Dead drops only work if the living behave. The church had the right acoustics for discretion, stones swallowing footsteps, incense masking wool and fear. I moved like a woman who came to ask the Virgin about rent. Near the second confessional, a votive flickered. Our candle. I knelt, set my parcel in the pew rack as if I meant to free my hands for prayer, and slid a thimble, the cheap, dented one everyone recognized, under the edge. The thimble was the claim ticket. No thimble, no parcel. No mistakes that way. In the hush, a cough from the narthex gave the all's well we'd agreed upon. I kept my eyes on the statue's feet while a black-clad silhouette paused by the rack, frowned at the lack of piety in the world, and gathered the paper bundle with the offended dignity of a sacristan who had seen worse. The thimble vanished with it. The candle guttered once, then steadied. We were done. On the way out, I bought 2 tapers for show, lit one, and let the other travel in my pocket to the person who would need fire more than light. At the steps, the boy with the broom from the mercery waited, pretending to tie a shoe. He didn't look up. Rain tonight, he said, to the pavement. Good for laundry. Rain meant burn after reading. Laundry meant no copy kept. I nodded, an agreement with weather. Not every handoff deserved a church. Sometimes the city preferred silliness to sanctity. In the arcade by the tram stop, I pinned a closed for lunch note to my bag, the note a pattern piece cut on the bias. The bias line pointed at a rubbish bin no one emptied on Mondays. Inside, under yesterday's headlines, lay a parcel wrapped in the same brown paper but tied once only. Station stairs, then. I slipped it into the bag without breaking step. At home, I unrolled what the sacristan had left in return, a pattern for a gentleman's overcoat, sizes 48-50-52 chalked in an elegant hand. Big men traveling, lots of them, late. The seam allowances were too generous by half. That margin was our warning, extra guards. In the facing, he basted a strip of cloth with 3 careless stitches. They weren't careless. Free meant third span on the bridge. I traced it all with my finger, then fed it to a pan of water, stirred it to pulp, and spread the paste under the lining of a real customer's skirt. Invisible, useful, gone. By dusk, the pattern had already done its work twice. Once when it moved through the city without a name, and once when it taught me how to move without being seen. I turned the sign on my door to open again and pinned a hem for a woman who only wanted to look respectable at her cousin's wedding. Respectability is a fine cover. So is love. Numbers spoken get people killed, numbers stitched get them home. My tape looked like any other, centimeters one side, inches the other, but along the edge I'd pricked the varnish with a dressmaker's wheel. Every 7th mark had a second ghost tooth. To a customer, it meant nothing. To me, it said group by 7s, read the tooth as 0. I could slide the tape across an order form and measure a sleeve while counting wagons. Knots travel better than ink. I kept a pocket cord, waxed, thin, obedient, and tied it as I bundled finished work. A reef knot at 10 meant East Spur. A slipped knot meant temporary siding. A granny knot, never used by anyone competent, meant beware, inspection teams. A courier could carry a dozen garments out of my shop, cords fluttering, and no one would guess her arms held a timetable. Buttons talk too, if you let them. 4-hole. I stitched them with a code that looked like laziness. 2 holes only, vertical or horizontal. Vertical, move. Horizontal, hold. Cross-stitch meant guards attached. To fix a button is domestic. To read one is insurgency. I learned to count a convoy by the way the men complained. A man made for walking curses a train that stops too often. A man made for sitting curses a train that never does. When an adjutant grumbled that his coffee froze between yard 2 and yard 3, I measured his cuff with my tape and found tooth. Tooth, smooth along the marks. Free stops, not 2. He didn't notice my smile. Men rarely do when admiring themselves. At home, I laid the tape along pattern paper and copied the cadence. 7 marks to a line, tooth as 0, long as 5. The line sang a simple song, 38, 42, 41. The same refrain I'd hidden in the lieutenant's hem. When patterns rhyme, the city is telling you the truth. You only have to listen until the chalk dust settles. To move this without paper, I threaded a tailor's tack through my sleeve seam. Long, short, long. Our sign for repeat, the last figure. Anyone could see the tack. No one could read it unless they had learned their first numbers with a needle. For the final cipher, I used the thing every man trusts, a measuring call. 42 at the chest, I'd say loudly, then turn to the tape and murmur the rest to myself. 38, 41. My girl in the back room would note the order, pencil sliding across scrap with the speed of any apprentice. She wasn't writing sizes. She was writing trains. We practiced mistakes the way choirs practice breathing. Drop a chalk, misread a number, ask for a repeat. Each error had a meaning. A dropped chalk meant at a guard wagon. A misread meant diversion 2 hours. A repeat meant bridge, counting will decide. People forgive clumsiness in a pretty shop. We weaponized forgiveness. By week's end, the tape had gathered a small harvest of routes, and my cords had tied more sleeves than a wedding season. No ledger, no map, only thread remembering where metal would go. I wound the tape, kissed my fingers, a habit my mother used to keep pins from pricking, and promised the numbers I would carry them where they needed to live. They pressed me into the depot tailor's annex one afternoon with a pass stamped so hard the paper bruised. The room smelled of oilcloth and hurry. Coats in stacks, belts in coils, boots lined like blunt arguments. A corporal pointed me at a mountain of mending and a clock that didn't believe in mercy. You, he said, are fast. He was right. He did not ask what else I was. Inside the fence, uniforms lose their swagger and gain weight. I handled straps warm from backs, collars that had memorized necks, belts with impressions where fingers grip when orders are ugly. Boots told me mud stories. Yellow from the embankment, black from the pit near yard 3, salt from road spray that only happens close to the coast. At the third bench, An orderly laid a sheaf of carbons by my elbow, movement orders to copy later. He trusted the pile because paper behaves around needles. I slid my hand under the top sheet, pressed with a pinhead, and came away with a smear of blue on my skin. ABT. T. Convoy K37, DP310. Enough to stitch into memory. Men talk less in the wolf's den, but their pockets forget to. I turned a lining to reseat a button and found a map scrap used as a reinforcement. It had a pencil X where the track crosses the marsh, an X so light it could be a mistake. I traced it with my nail through cloth, felt the paper give, and cut a new patch for my own stock. His map went back to his pocket looking untouched, minus its secret. Mine went into my thimble for the walk home. In a belt pouch, I found a broken pencil chewed to a confession. The chew marks were deep on one side only, left-handed, impatient, clerk's habit. The clerk in the yard office was right-handed. Good. A visitor, then. Visitors bring new mistakes. I stitched that knowledge into the flamboyance of a well-finished seam. A flourish no German ever notices and every Frenchwoman reads, stranger in the office. As I finished, the depot siren coughed. A test or a warning, hard to tell. Men looked up, then down, then back to their tasks, true soldiers of tedium. I left by the side gate with a receipt for work done and a thimble that suddenly weighed as much as a bridge. At my table, I eased the map scrap out from under the thimble dent by dent. The X sat where I expected, third span from the town side, the shallow pilings. Bridges pretend to be strong everywhere. They aren't. I copied the curve not with ink, but with a line of tacking on a harmless pattern piece. 3 stitches close, 1 wide, 3 close, the rhythm of spans over water. To get that rhythm to the right hands, I stitched it into the hem of a priest cassock I'd offered to shorten. He shook his head at my generosity and blessed me with a wave that meant be quick, be quiet. In the vestry, lace and linen hid conspiracies better than any trench. By midnight the cassock had walked past 2 checkpoints without inspection. Men measure piety by eye and never by hem length. The hem, loyal, carried a river's weak tooth up the nave and out into the square where the sacristan's parcel system could do the rest. Too many eyes on the church now, we moved back into laundry. Lines strung between windows write messages better than priests. I pegged a sheet with 3 blue clothespins in a row, blue for burn, 3 for third span, and watched from my counter as a widow across the alley pegged hers with 2 wooden pins and 1 white. I have it. We passed a bridge between cotton. At the river bend, washerwomen beat cloth against smooth stones that had learned everyone's family name. I brought a basket of work that was only a conversation starter. Soap shavings carry whispers well. I tipped a handful toward a friend and let 2 brass washers fall among them. She scooped them up, skedded the price of soap, and pocketed the metal. Washers mean bolts. Bolts mean rail. No words. Water here's too much. On market days, steps of St. Martin became our bulletin board. A red ribbon tied to the lowest iron rung. No meeting. A white today. A black. Danger. I carried all 3 in my pocket and tied whichever the morning deserved. Fingers steady. Feet unremarkable. Couriers need errands. I gave them respectable ones. A mended apron delivered to a grocer meant South Road clear. A sack of scraps for stuffing handed to a miller's wife meant patrols near the ford. Children played at shop in the arcade. One girl took my coins and pressed a marble into my palm. A cat's eye, green, then winked. Green meant go tonight. She never once looked up at my face. Good girl. Sometimes we used our own shadows. I would pass a window and let my reflection pause with my hand on my throat. Hold. 2 hands. Urgent. These were for days when paper would be suicide and candles would be sermons. Under all of it, the schedule moved like a river under ice. We could feel its pull even when we could not see it. Men in boots thought they owned the banks. They never guessed what women build under winter. That week the city learned the taste of curfew. Doors shut sooner. Lights grew shyer. Hunger got louder. I hung my closed sign early and threaded a new string through the hole. Plain twine with a single knot halfway up. To anyone else, a repair. To our people, half the guards rerouted. The boy from the mercery limped by with a broom and didn't limp at the corner. The limp was for anyone behind him. The fact that it vanished was for me. On Sunday, I sat 3 pews from the back and watched the sacristan polish a candlestick he had polished yesterday. He polished when he was waiting. I let my eyes wander, then settle on the floor tile with the crack we used as a line. He placed the candlestick on the line, just so. The line passed under the third span on the bridge when drawn over the town map. The church had joined our arithmetic. When I left, it was raining, the kind that cleans faces and leaves clothes dirty. At the steps, someone had tied no ribbon at all. No news can be news. It meant tonight the city will speak plainly. We were ready to listen. At dusk, the martial order rode the teleprinter. Convoy K-37. Departure moved forward by 2 hours to 1:10. They thought surprise belonged only to them. The yardman who brought me his sleeve for a quick repair muttered that the brake crew was light. Not enough men to walk the length in time. I lengthened his cuff by a sinful half-centimeter and thanked his grievance. Our career ladder snapped into place. The widow's sheet flew 3 blues. The grocer's apron went into a basket bound for the miller. The sacristan tied nothing at all. I set the last hem of the night and placed my thimble on the sill, dent facing out, the sign for bridge, third span. Below my window, the boy with the broom paused and tilted it twice toward the river. Even the broom had learned to point. I sent a last parcel, a gentleman's overcoat forgotten at my shop, delivered to the yard office with the lining seam raised just enough to annoy a clerk. Inside the seam, a horsehair stiffener with 3 knots. Third span, count to 3, then brief. If they had only read clothes the way they read maps. After midnight, rain changed its mind and became strategy. Boots slipped. Lamps guttered. Men cursed their mothers and the gods of locomotives. On the bridge, the third span wore its usual thin smile. Downriver, 2 men who were not bridge workers checked a watch that did not tick. They moved with the patience of husbands mending chairs. In the yard, an inspector decided to be diligent and ordered a brake test. Good for him. Better for us. Brake hiss at car 26, clunk at 27, silence at 28. Someone walked back with a lantern to find the fault at the coupling. He found it, half found it, because a washer was missing and the pin sat wrong. He hammered, swore, went to fetch another man with better shoulders. 10 minutes gone. Out at the marsh curve, a tree limb and a polite slide of mud made the point sticky. The signal took a second longer to clear. Seconds are generous creatures when you know how to ask them for help. Convoy K-37 heaved itself forward at 1:32. Already tired, already late. At the bridge, the engineer throttled down, the way men do when steel sings a note their teeth don't like. The third span offered its narrow truth. On its far end, the rails gleamed where hands had cleaned them lovingly. Too lovingly. A man notices that with his feet before his eyes. He touched the brake. The coupled cars answered with a language only shunters love. Clack, sigh, resist. Far under the deck, at the piling men had circled on maps they would never see. A small idea persuaded the night to change shape. Not a grand roar. A cough. A hinge. A failure of certainty. The span did not give up. It sulked, which is worse. The engineer stopped because he was a decent man who wanted to live and keep the men behind him from dying stupid. The column stalled across the river like a sentence with its verb missing. Behind, officers argued with physics. Ahead, a roadblock discovered it did not need to exist. Somewhere else entirely, a unit that had planned to slip along a quiet road met men who had grown bored of being quiet. One operation unpicked, stitch by stitch, because cloth remembers how it was assembled, and so do women. Morning wore rumor like a borrowed coat. The papers said weather. The officers said sabotage. The station master said the bridge was temperamental and had always been a little French. I opened my shop at 9 and hemmed a skirt for a woman who wanted to look strong at her son's sentencing. Strength is a fit you cut yourself. By 10, Boots hammered my stare. Inspection, said a man I had never measured and never would. They turned bolts on my machines, shook out my rags, read my pins like tea leaves, and saw only steel. The lieutenant with the shaving soap returned his coat for a tightness at the hem. I pressed it for him until he could see his vanity in the wool. He did not thank me. He never had to. They found nothing because I keep nothing. My shop is a mouth that eats secrets and leaves only thread. That afternoon, the sacristan closed the church for repairs no one had budgeted. The widow took in her sheet without pegs. The grocer sold out of onions he did not stock. The boy with the broom limped for real this time. You can only pretend so long before your body insists on taking a turn. I packed a case with the tools I would miss least and the pictures I would miss most. I left my sign, turned to closed for mourning, and meant it. We mourned quietly here, even our victories. On the back wall, where daylight never reaches, I ripped a seam I had sewn the day I opened. 3 stitches up, 3 down, long across. The first pattern I had hidden for myself. It came away clean. I folded the strip and put it in my pocket. At the station, half the trains ran and the other half sulked on sidings. I bought a ticket to nowhere with a ration book that belonged to a woman who had taught me how to keep pins out of my mouth when men shouted. I boarded with the last of the decent people, women, children, one old man who carried a clock without hands. We crossed the river on a different bridge that had not learned our language yet. I did not look down. In my lap, the case was light. In my pocket, the seam weighed like a coin. At the next town, I would be a seamstress again, and a liar, and a woman who understands the difference between the two only in the privacy of her own kitchen. Before the train left, a man in civilian clothes sat beside me without asking. He smelled of damp stone and candle smoke. "Your hem," he said in a voice that wanted to be careful, was very straight. I nodded. He placed a thimble on the seat between us. Cheap, dented, beloved. Then he stood and moved to another carriage, because that is how we say thank you when windows have ears. I rode until the fields stopped matching the ones I knew by heart. When I stepped down at last, I carried nothing anyone could use against anyone else. Not names, not papers, only a tape, a needle, a habit of listening, and a seam no one would ever examine. If they come to ask me what I did, years from now, in a room with tea and a granddaughter who thinks sewing is quaint, I will tell her the truth the way we always told it. I kept my stitches small. I tied my knots tight. And when a city needed a seam ripped, I pulled the right thread.